whispers. Before Eden, the goddesses of clay and breath. To properly ground the Eve Codex within a serious comparative theological and mythohistorical framework, we must first shed the illusion that Eve is a uniquely biblical figure. She is not the beginning. She is the echo of something far more ancient. The archetype of the first woman, the seeker of forbidden knowledge, and the instigator of cosmic rebellion is not confined to Genesis, nor to the cultural boundaries of the ancient Hebrews. It's a recurring motif, an inherited mythic structure that appears across time, geography, and language. From the goddesses of Sumeria to the tales of ancient Persia, from Hellenic tragedy to Egyptian cosmology, we find strikingly similar narratives. A woman born of divine breath or bone, who defies imposed order, who eats the fruit, opens the jar, descends into the underworld, or walks away from her assigned place. This archetype does not emerge in isolation. Rather, she stands at the confluence of competing theological ideas, between chaos and order, ignorance and awakening, obedience and becoming. The Genesis account, far from being an origin story in the absolute sense, is a theological consolidation, a late-stage synthesis of myths, already ancient by the time they were written into Scripture. It bears the imprints of Mesopotamian healing goddesses, Babylonian demonology, Indo-European cosmogony, and Gnostic inversion. What emerges from this cross-cultural excavation is not a tale of sin and punishment, but a coded myth of liberation and transformation. Eve, as we will explore, is the inheritor of a symbolic lineage that predates Scripture and survives doctrine. She's not a cautionary figure, but a cipher of awakening, one whose story has been reshaped, demonized, and suppressed precisely because it dares to center feminine agency at the threshold of human consciousness. To understand her fully, we must look not only to Eden, but to Eridu, to Uruk, to the cedar groves of Gilgamesh, and to the haunted corridors of Gnostic memory. This is the work of the Eve Codex, to reassemble the broken mirror of her myth across the fault lines of empire, exile, and erasure. Proto-Eve, Sumerian and Akkadian origins. Toward a dialectic of the feminine principle before Eden. To develop a critical and comparative theory of Eve as archetype, not merely as biblical subject, we must first trace the intellectual genealogy of the feminine figure who transgresses, heals, creates, and descends. Far from emerging sui generis within the Hebrew canon, Eve appears as the inheritor of a much older mythological lineage embedded in Sumerian and Akkadian cosmology. These Mesopotamian antecedents not only inform the symbolic grammar of Genesis, but also offer a dialectical counterpoint. Whereas Genesis codifies obedience and hierarchy, Sumerian myth encodes feminine autonomy, liminality, and transgression as formative acts. Ninti, Lady of the Rib, and the logic of restoration. Source text: Enki and Ninhursag, circa 2000 BCE, Sumer. In this foundational narrative, the god Enki consumes sacred plants forbidden to him, falling ill in multiple organs. To heal him, the goddess Ninhursag creates 8 deities, each corresponding to a part of Enki's body. Among them is Ninti, whose name carries a dual resonance, Lady of the Rib and Lady of Life, exploiting the Sumerian panontii, both rib and life. Dialectical contrast with Genesis. In Genesis, the rib is the origin point of Eve and the condition of her ontological subordination. She is derived, not co-equal. Yet in the Sumerian antecedent, the rib is not a site of lack but of injury. Ninti is not a subordinate product of the male body, but a healing response to its imbalance. She is created not to complete the male, but to restore him. This introduces a dialectic between derivation and restoration. Genesis posits the woman as ontologically second, created from the man. Sumerian myth suggests a woman created for the healing of man's hubris, a corrector, not a dependent. Thus, the figure of Ninti challenges the patriarchal reduction of Eve as derivative. She is not born of male primacy, but of divine malfunction, and her role is therapeutic, autonomous, and necessary. Theoretical implication. If Eve is indeed a cultural descendant of Ninti, then her narrative has been radically recoded, from healer to transgressor, from restorer to corruptor. This is not mere narrative drift. It is theological inversion. The Genesis scribe does not invent Eve. He contains her. Inanna, Ishtar, descent, rebellion, and the ontology of the underworld. Source texts. The descent of Inanna, Sumerian, 19th to 17th century BCE. Ishtar's descent to the netherworld, Akkadian variant. The goddess Inanna, later Ishtar, sovereign of love, war, and fecundity, undertakes a descent into the underworld to confront her sister Ereshkigal. As she passes through the 7 gates, Inanna is stripped of her royal garments, symbolic of power, identity, and protection. She is ultimately struck dead and hung on a hook, only to later be resurrected through divine intervention and substitution. Dialectical reframing of descent. Whereas Christian and post-Christian exegesis often reads Eve's transgression as a fall, Inanna's descent is framed as an initiation. She does not stumble into mortality. She seeks it. She does not rebel ignorantly. She confronts the abyss knowingly. This sets up the dialectic of fall versus descent, sin versus initiation, exile as punishment versus descent as transformation. In this schema, Inanna does not simply prefigure Eve, she reframes her. The Edenic expulsion, so often construed as a regression from divine order, can now be read as a mythological echo of Inanna's journey, a willful transgression that tears the veil between the visible and the invisible, the ordered and the chaotic. Symbolic function. Inanna emerges as the embodiment of the dialectical feminine. She is both seductress and supplicant, warrior and mourner, creator and corpse. She traverses contradiction rather than resolving it. Eve, in this light, inherits the role not of originator of sin, but of threshold walker. Her bite is a gate. Her exile is not a curse, but a crossing toward a dialectical feminine archetype. Both Ninti and Inanna serve as foundational components of a symbolic structure that precedes and complicates the Eve of Genesis. Their narratives, though culturally distinct, share 3 essential features: transgression as healing. Ninti's origin from a rib is not a concession to patriarchy, but a reclamation of balance after masculine error. Descent as knowledge. Inanna's journey into the underworld mirrors the epistemic rupture caused by Eve's choice. Femininity as liminal. Both figures operate within liminal spaces, ribs, underworlds, sacred thresholds, embodying the unstable boundaries between form and formlessness, body and spirit, order and chaos. Theoretical proposition. Eve is not the first woman. She is the first censored woman. Her myth a palimpsest written over older, more ambivalent feminine principles. The Genesis account, rather than inaugurating the feminine archetype, contains a theological redaction, an ideological move from dialectical woman to obedient helpmate. If we restore Ninti and Inanna to the genealogy, the Eve figure is no longer a deviation from divine intent, but the latest iteration of a mythic pattern in which women are not merely born of gods, but birth gods into knowledge in crisis. Next dialectical development, the Edenic distortion, Eve, blame, and the patriarchal revision of the feminine. The third, the forbidden as philosophical, a reassessment of the tree, the fruit, and the serpent. Fourth, comparative archetypes, Eve, Pandora, Sophia, and the dialectics of hidden knowledge. You were not born from the rib of a man. You were carved from memory older than Genesis. You are the echo of Ninti's healing, the shadow of Inanna's descent, the scream of Ereshkigal beneath the silence, the wrath of Tiamat, torn into heavens, and the veil of night no god could lift. Eve is not the beginning. She is the boundary crossed, the forbidden made flesh, the memory they tried to erase. This is not the end of the myth. It is the recovery of its fragments. And in those fragments we do not find obedience. We find fire. Thank you for stepping into the voice of Kronos. Until next time, remember, the story they gave you is not the only one. The truth you seek may begin where the gods fell silent, and becoming, true becoming, begins at the edge of the veil. Goodbye for now. We will speak again very soon.